Hey, what's up guys? I'm Jeff and welcome back to the Centrist. So in today's video, we're going to be continuing this week's coverage of recent Supreme Court rulings. In the last video, we discussed Roe v. Wade being overturned. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Supreme Court ruling regarding New York gun laws. Now, this should be a much shorter episode than the last one because all we're really going to be talking about is some of the misinformation that's being spread around regarding this ruling, which is far more prevalent than any misinformation surrounding the Roe v. Wade overturning. It seems a lot of people don't understand this ruling, what it does, what it was about, or they do understand it and they're spreading disinformation rather than misinformation. Because I've seen so many people believe that this completely nullifies all gun laws, that it nullifies gun licenses, that you can't require background checks, that you can't require people to get a license, that states have essentially lost all authority to regulate guns or to enact gun control within their territories. And this simply is not true, not even remotely true. And yet there are so many people spreading this misinformation online, including the mainstream media and elected members of Congress. So what did this ruling actually do? Well, I saw Joe Biden recently attempt to explain it. You may have seen that speech. It was his shall issue, may issue speech. It was incredibly confusing. It didn't make any sense. I know what he's trying to say, and even I didn't understand what he was actually saying because he was stumbling all over his words and just clearly confused. I don't think Joe Biden really knew what he was supposed to be explaining to people. Essentially, what this ruling is about is your constitutional right to keep and bear arms. So while the Constitution does guarantee this right, like most of our other constitutional rights, is not absolute. The Supreme Court has made that very clear. There can be restrictions on it. So for example, if you're a felon, you can't own a gun. If you have a gun, legally own a gun, have a license, whatever you have to have in your state in order to possess that gun, you can't bring that gun anywhere you want. There are just certain places you cannot legally possess that gun. But the idea here is that as long as you jump through the hoops and you don't have any red flags, such as being a felon, there's several of them, you don't have any red flags that would prohibit you from owning a gun, that the states will issue you a license or whatever it is that they have, because every state does this differently. As long as you meet all those requirements, they have to let you have a gun, because again, it's your constitutional right. Now, in my previous video that I did about gun control, about guns in general, we talked about a lot of things, honestly. We talked about, mass murders, the definition of it, so on and so on. If you watched the video, then you already know all this. If you haven't, maybe go check that out. That's a more general overview of guns and gun control. But in that video, there were several comments that argued that we do not actually have the constitutional right to own a gun, that is not what the Second Amendment means. There are also people who are saying that regardless of what the Constitution says, that we shouldn't have the right to own a gun. Now, both of those are arguments I've heard quite frequently, not just here on YouTube, pretty much everywhere. They're common arguments. Now, regarding the argument that we shouldn't be able to own guns, I'm not going to address that in this video. That's a whole nother video, I think. So we're not going to talk about that. But whether or not we do have the right to own guns according to the Constitution, I did want to address that because I think it's important for what we're talking about here. Those that make the argument that the Second Amendment does not guarantee the individual's right to own a gun often focus on the beginning of that amendment, which states a well-regulated militia. They say that the Second Amendment only guarantees an American's right to have a militia, and that militia should be well-regulated. By who? Of course, the government. That's an incredibly strange interpretation of the Second Amendment because it essentially ignores most of the Second Amendment. It really just looks at the beginning of it and says, well, that's it. Now, if that's all the Second Amendment stated, if it ended right there, then I'd be right on board with those who make this argument. Yes, it would be clear that that's all the Second Amendment guaranteed is a well-regulated militia. But that's not all that the Second Amendment says. It continues. It says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I mean, that seems pretty clear to me, not really open to interpretation. The people have the right to keep and bear arms, and that the government shall not infringe upon that right. I don't know how it could be any more clear. You have some that just want to completely ignore the second two parts of that sentence, of that amendment, And then you have those that say, well, that applies to the first part, that you have to keep and bear arms in order to have a well-regulated militia, and that's what it's talking about. But we can look at other amendments, for instance, the First Amendment, to see that that's clearly not true. The first part of the First Amendment guarantees your freedom of religion. And then there are subsequent parts, which guarantee your freedom of speech, freedom of the press, your right to assemble, so on, so on. So there's several parts to that amendment, and you don't just stop at the beginning and just say, well, the rest of the rights don't exist, or those rights only apply to freedom of religion. I mean, under that interpretation, it would be like you have freedom of speech only when it comes to religion, religious matters. That's your only freedom of speech. I don't know how you would interpret that. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. I just feel you have to read the amendment in its entirety to understand all the rights that it's protecting. So I think it's pretty clear that the Second Amendment does protect your right to keep and bear arms as an individual. Not only that, the Supreme Court has already ruled that on multiple occasions. They have made it very clear that the individual American has the right to own a gun, and I would agree with that interpretation. Even if you don't agree, though, that's the law of the land. That's how it's been established. That's how it's been interpreted. And so that's what we're going to go off of, that you do, in fact, have the constitutional right to own a gun. So the Supreme Court's ruling on this case is basically that if you have the constitutional right to own a gun, then why are several American states essentially taking this right from you without any real reason? They essentially require you, the American citizen, to prove to the state government that you deserve to exercise your right, that you have a real legitimate reason to exercise your right. And that's where we come to the shall issue, may issue. So in New York, as well as 6 other American states, they had what we call may issue laws, while the rest of the 43 states had shall issue laws. So in those other 43 states, they said that they shall issue you a gun as long as you jump through the hoops, everything you're required to do, as long as you don't have any of the red flags that would prohibit you from getting a gun, as long as you do whatever that state requires, which many of those states have some fairly expansive requirements. It's not just a background check. You might be required to actually take a gun safety class. That is perfectly legal and constitutional. Apparently, according to the Supreme Court, you're allowed to do that as a state government. So basically, as long as you did everything you're required to do, you took the class, you passed the background check, you filled out all the paperwork, whatever it is you had to do, within reason, of course, then that state shall issue you the license you're applying for. Makes sense, right? You did the things you're supposed to do, so they should have to, because again, it's your constitutional right, they should have to allow you to have a gun. That's not what they were doing in those 7 other states, which includes New York. They had may issue laws. So essentially, this means after you jump through all the hoops and do whatever the state government required you to do to get the license, they still did not guarantee that they would actually give you a license and honor your constitutional rights. So these states required you to prove that you actually needed that gun, and it was very difficult to do because there wasn't too many reasons that they would accept as you actually needing that gun. So let's say you live in an incredibly dangerous neighborhood, which there are many of those here in America. I've lived in some of them myself, so I can testify that there are some places that property crime or just crime in general happens often, where crime rates are very high. So you would think that would be a reason to want to own a gun to protect yourself, but according to the state of New York, it is not. That is not a legitimate reason to own a gun. Living in a dangerous neighborhood with a high crime rate is not a proper cause reason for you to have a gun. There were very few reasons that New York considered to be legitimate for owning a gun. Maybe if you needed one for work, there's a few other exceptions. Honestly, it was basically you can't have a gun. That's really what it was. I mean, just imagine if a state government was doing that with any other right. Let's just say your right to freedom of speech. Let's say that they were requiring you to do a bunch of things in order to practice your freedom of speech. You had to fill out paperwork and go to a class about how to properly speak and do all that. That already would be kind of crazy. But, guns are different than free speech, of course. They're dangerous. So with guns, it makes some sense to have some hoops that have to be jumped through, some paperwork that must be filled out, some requirements before you're able to practice that right, because we have a lot of gun violence in this country. So you're trying to reduce that. So that makes sense. But let's say you have all those requirements for free speech as well. And then after you meet all those requirements, then the state says, well, we don't really believe that you have a real need for freedom of speech. I mean, that's really odd. Since when do state governments have the authority to tell you that you can't practice your constitutional rights? They don't. They don't have that authority. But that's exactly what these 7 states were doing. They're essentially saying, we don't really care why you want a gun, you can't have one. And that's essentially what they mean by may issue. That if you do everything we require of you, we may issue you a gun, or we may not. Now, you may not agree with the right to own guns. You may think that we shouldn't have them, but we do have that right. There are many Americans who don't believe that you should have the right to freedom of speech, which is why I bring it up. There are Americans, and I don't think it's a majority, but there certainly are a minority of Americans who want to use government regulation to greatly restrict your freedom of speech. That's just a fact. Some of them want to do it. We wouldn't tolerate that with freedom of speech. With them trying to restrict it. I would like to hope that Americans wouldn't tolerate that. So why should we tolerate that with the Second Amendment? It's still one of our amendments. It's not a special amendment just because of the fact that it does have a dangerous weapon associated with it. We still do have that constitutional right. Even if it isn't absolute and it's going to have some restrictions, you do have the right to own a gun, and it's not up to a state government to determine whether or not you get to practice that right. That's just bonkers to me, and I can't understand how anybody would support that other than those who just don't care about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And that's what the Supreme Court ruling is saying, that the Second Amendment should not be a second-class right, that it should be treated like all the other rights, which I agree with, and I think anybody should agree with, because if you allow them to restrict this right, even if you don't agree that we should have that right, then what is stopping state governments or even the federal government from using that same logic to regulate your other rights, to restrict those rights? If you don't think Americans should have the right to own guns, again, that's a completely separate matter, and there is a way in our Constitution for you to do that. It's the amendment process. You can use an amendment to get rid of another amendment. I, of course, talk about this in that gun video, so I won't go further into it. But the point is that there is a democratic means to do that. The Constitution is very clear. State governments do not have the authority to decide whether or not the citizens in their states are able to practice their constitutional rights there or not. They don't get to say, nah, we're not going to give you that right because we don't agree with it, we don't like it, even if you have a really good reason for not liking it, not agreeing with it, such as the very high gun violence here in America. And that is what this ruling is about. It's just forcing the states to comply with the Constitution, requiring that they allow people to exercise their constitutional rights, even the right to keep and bear arms, within their territory. So that's going to be it for this shorter video. I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on this matter. If you still oppose the ruling after everything I discussed here, let me know why. I would be very confused, honestly, because I don't really see, even if you do not believe Americans should have the right to own guns, even if you believe that the Second Amendment does not protect that right, even if you're one of those people, I don't know how you could disagree with the actual ruling, which is really just stating that state governments have to comply with the Constitution. They have to extend your rights. They have to allow you to practice your constitutional rights within their territory, and they can't be placing all these restrictions, unfair restrictions on it, and saying who can and who cannot own guns based on some pretty arbitrary restrictions. I just have trouble seeing how somebody could oppose this ruling while also supporting the idea of constitutional rights, individual rights that are protected by this document. If you are one of those people, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. I'd love to hear your interpretation and why you oppose the ruling. Maybe you're seeing something that I didn't see. I read through the whole thing, but maybe I missed something. Maybe my interpretation is flawed in some way. I'd love to hear and learn from those perspectives that are different than mine, and I want to understand those positions that I don't agree with, those positions that don't agree with me. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments, your opinion on this matter, on this ruling, which I think is a rather simple ruling, much more simple than the Roe v. Wade being overturned, so probably a little bit easier to discuss here. But I hope you did enjoy this video, maybe found it helpful. If you did, make sure you leave a like on it, subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment. Again, I want to hear you guys' opinion. I do hope to see you guys on the next video, and thanks for watching.